Well, Cat Hobbs is the founder and director of We Own It, which campaigns for public ownership. So, Cat, Royal Mail, its market value is more than £4 billion now. I mean, compensating shareholders, with that money you could pay for 26,000 nurses, 12,000 doctors for 2 years. There's better ways to spend the money, surely.
Good evening. Well, we haven't heard the full proposals on Royal Mail, but what I think is fantastic about this announcement is that we know that public ownership is really, really popular. When you look at YouGov polling, you can see that for the Royal Mail, for the energy companies, for the railway companies, there's a majority of people in this country who want to see these services brought into public ownership.
But that cost of re-nationalising Royal Mail, £4 billion. I mean, there's better ways to spend money when the government's got a £50 billion deficit, isn't there?
Well, I think we need to take a long view, which is exactly what the government didn't do when they sold off the Royal Mail. The Royal Mail was sold off for around £3 billion. At that time, it was making a profit of £300 million a year. So we've done research with the New Economics Foundation showing that within 10 years, we're going to be worse off. The British public will be worse off because of that sale. Now, that was a short-term decision, and we need to take some long-term decisions to bring public assets into public hands. How much would you compensate shareholders? That's a question that would have to be decided. But is it a good deal to have public profits going back into the public purse? Absolutely.
Well, let's have a look at the railways then. I mean, rail privatisation's been a huge success in terms of passenger journeys. Passenger journeys have doubled in the last 20 years. In the 35 last years of British Rail, they fell by a third.
Well, under British Rail, we saw a lot of underinvestment by the government on purpose. But what I would say is if you're a passenger and you're looking at the outrageous fares that people are paying, which are the highest fares in Europe, if you're on a packed carriage trying to get to work, I think you'd question the idea that our railways are a success.
Well, hold on, that's because we're trying to get the passengers themselves to pay for the railways rather than taxpayers. That's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, the thing is that if you brought the railways into public ownership, you could actually save £1.2 billion a year. And that money could be used to reduce fares or to make better services.
How do you work that out?
So that's from a Rebuilding Rail report that basically shows the money from the shareholder profits, but also the money that comes from having a more integrated system. Because right now, our railway is very, very fragmented, and it's a real mess. So if you integrated that system and you reinvested the profits back into the system, you would have a more efficient system. But
the rail operators make a margin of just 3 pence in the pound. I mean, that's not going to be enough to cut fares meaningfully, is it? I mean, also, bear in mind, I mean, since privatisation, the railways are now actually more or less paying for themselves. They never, ever did that in the whole nationalisation period.
The railways receive a huge amount of subsidy. And what we've seen is that public ownership is much more efficient. So we saw that with the East Coast franchise. In 2009, the company failed on the East Coast franchise. The government came in and ran it in public ownership for 5 years until 2014. It returned £1 billion to the Treasury. It was the most efficient franchise in the UK. So I think public ownership works really well, and we've got an ideological problem here that says, oh, surely private companies have to do everything. No, they don't. They're good at some things. They don't have to do everything.
East Coast returned £1 billion over 5 years. In private hands, I mean, Virgin Trains East Coast is going to return £3.3 billion over 8 years. That's a much better per annum return to the taxpayer.
If you look at the comparative figures at the time, East Coast got to the point where it was receiving zero subsidy, while the Virgin comparable line was receiving quite a bit of subsidy. So it's basically, it was the most efficient rail line in the UK, and the statistics show.
Well, isn't that because it's got competition on the... I mean, East Coast has competition from Hull Trains and Grand Central. I mean, it's competition that spurred this improvement, isn't it?
No. When East Coast was run in public ownership, it was able to retrieve more money and it returned that money to the public purse. So when you've got a service run in public ownership, you're not wasting money on shareholder profits.
Well, three pence in the pound doesn't sound a waste, really.
But we needn't waste that money. We could reinvest that money for the benefit of passengers. And we know that 66% of people want to see the railway in public ownership because they're sick of it. And if you talk to somebody on a train platform about competition, they're going to say, well, the next train that comes along, that's the train I'm getting on.
All right, one last question, Kat. Why should less well-off passengers... Most train journeys are into London every day. Why should less well-off passengers subsidise people commuting into the city every day?
Well, I think the railway is good for our economy and it's good for the country as a whole. It takes cars off the road if it's a good alternative for people. So the railway is an important part of how people get around, but it needs to be in public ownership.
All right, Cat Hobbs, got to leave it there.
Thanks
a lot.